And these kind of technologies will only be improving the kinds of outcomes that I think our two respective parties really want to see. And we see moves in that arena toward in Ethereum, the way that we can create legal contracts that people are finding very useful, but that are not requiring these state-based intermediaries. Just in the way that we can have cryptocurrencies and exchanges of this kind that are not that are kind of beyond the 21st century, the 20th century model, rather.
Oh, is it recording the back?
Yeah, that's exactly. I had to flip it back. I don't know. I don't even know how that happened. But there we go. Yeah, it was awesome. Recording. It was recording an extreme close up of my monitor.
Nice. I thought you were going for some cool intro there.
yeah. I could have maybe done a whip pan or something.
Right.
All right. So this is a Futurist New Deal podcast, and we're having a third in our series of cross-party debates between a Libertarian Party and Transhumanist Party. And I'm here with Dan Behrman, and we're going to talk. Hey, tell us a little bit about Dan Behrman. What are you working on?
So I'm in the campaign or outside of that.
Whatever. What do you think what do you think that would be the number one takeaway about yourself, or tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, man, I hate these conversations because I never know where to start, and there's like a million tangents. I could talk about the fact that I've kind of removed myself from the system. I haven't had a driver's license or registered a car in about 10 years, probably more than that now. And that was, when I was a kid, my first interaction with the government was really, aside from public schools, was getting traffic tickets. So I started learning how to fight those, and then I found out, hey, this is all smoke and mirrors. And then I took kind of a hacktivist approach to like, hey, how can I shut this system down or pull myself out of this system? So I've got a long history of messing around with that system. I'm a software engineer, so one of the things I'm working on now is actually a decentralized type social network, which I know there's a lot of different platforms out there that are trying to achieve that same goal. And of course, I have to say mine is the best. But all ego aside, it does take kind of the best from both worlds. Instead of saying, hey, we're going to be nothing like Facebook or Twitter, it's actually saying like, okay, look, we understand there's a consumer need on those platforms. So we're kind of like taking the best of that plus the best of privacy and security and controlling your own data.
To be creating those protocols, which clearly you probably could speak of at great length, that would allow for us to move beyond this for-profit model. In this particular area, this model has led to some issues, and I think a more distributed and decentralized approach. And it's kind of like the Ethereum contract thing. There's no reason that we couldn't do it. There's just a behemoth which has a pretty strange relationship to any number of state-run capitalist institutions. Right. Cambridge Analytica still exists. It just changed the name.
It's interesting to see, when we get used to something and we're stuck in this like mentality of that's just the way it is. It's really difficult to see outside of that. And we saw, decades ago when the internet was first coming around, everyone was like, oh yeah, well, that's not going to do much. I'm sure I even thought like, yeah, the information superhighway, that sounds really boring. What are we going to do? Sit in traffic all day? And it's not until, because like, it's not one person that came up with the internet. It's the internet is like comprised of so many millions of different like innovations and different companies and content producers and everything that it never would have, like, one person couldn't have imagined it all. Or Steve Jobs would have been much richer, I guess.
Yeah. And there was a kind of a gag at the turn of the 18th century, the 19th century, about 200 years ago. People are talking about all of these sideshows and dog and pony shows about electricity. This is electricity. And the reaction of the ordinary person was, what are we ever going to use that for? We
Right.
kind of have to be willing to get into the sandbox with all of these things as they're coming along, and that involves allowing for new kinds of institutions in the socio-political sphere as well as in new markets.
Right. Well, what's interesting about, you point out electricity, internet's becoming that too, but electricity is like, it's become, only a couple hundred years ago, nobody had it. And now it's like everybody has it and it's a human right and everybody must have it and it must be provided by some unseen force that, the government must provide or something like it's almost to that point. And the reality is like there are still people in this world who live without it and they live great lives without it. Obviously it helps, with so many things, improving the quality of life, but at the same time, like it's so it's like that same mindset of living without electricity. That's so unheard of. Who could even imagine that? And it's like we get stuck in whatever world that we're living in, and it's always really difficult to see outside of that.
And Amazon, Google, Elon Musk they're all doing this where they're releasing these mini satellites that have this capability of beaming a much lower cost and very reliable data to everyone on Earth. And
Right.
one of the I just finished a long form pamphlet about the Futurist New Deal. It's going to be published on Sunday. And one of the points of the Futurist New Deal that we've been promoting, it's not the top point, but is that data for all is a public good, and it serves to open up new markets and make people more dynamic, engaged in the world around them. And but rather than writing this piece in that pamphlet on that as a municipal service, I chose to write basically about the way that Musk and Google and Amazon are going to be reducing the cost of these things. Not every thing. There are some areas in which I believe we need to be careful about deregulating as it relates to human development and health, particularly. But there are an awful lot of areas, in right to try legislation with the FDA, and in areas relating to media, where we want to try things on for size and see how they work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's another kind of issue that I have with a lot of what politicians are pushing is like they always, you always get a politician that says, here's a new policy and we're going to force this on the entire country, something that's never been tried before, or at least not exactly the way that it would be implemented. And then it's once it's implemented, you are forced to participate in it. And that kind of like, it takes out the experimentation phase where we see, does this actually work? And if it does work to some extent, then you get into the mentality of, okay, well, it works. Why mess with it when really there might be something that's 100 times better? We're just not even allowed to try it. And so it's kind of like, that's one of the main issues that I have with any kind of solutions that politicians might push, is that it's when you're forcing everyone to participate in it and you're removing all the other options. So like the right to try type stuff is really awesome because especially for somebody who's dying of a terminal illness, and they don't have 10 years to wait for FDA to approve a certain drug. Unfortunately, what we still see is with like the cannabis medications is that there's still very little experimentation that goes into it as far as like clinical research, because like as much as that's being legalized in different states, it's still federally illegal. So it's really difficult to get realistic research on what it actually does or doesn't do. So now it's kind of like, is it snake oil? Does it work? And nobody knows.
And it's interesting you mentioned that. I work with a few biotech startups here in Phoenix, and some of them are working on isolating these new cannabinoids that haven't really been explored as to there's we know of probably most people have on their tongues the words THC or CBD. There's one or two others that don't have some of the same effects, but have neuroprotective abilities, helping people avoid dementia and things. There's a host of these cannabinoids and terpenes that have different properties, healthful properties. THC is the only one that has a narcotizing a property, and it's even possible to be building novel cannabinoids using these methods. There's the scientist Jay Kiesling who developed this method of converting, genetically modifying yeast, brewer's yeast, so that it will produce other things, namely cannabinoids, instead of beer, instead of the alcohol content. Yeah, and that's one of the companies that I work very closely with is working on developing these new cannabinoids. The point being that research could have been done 40 years ago. Israeli scientists started doing some of this research 40 years ago, but instead we had a lot of wrong-headed policies about this sort of thing that really have held our society back in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, like realistically, like with the amount of, I mean, as our population has grown and as we've become more educated, our thought processing ability has gone insanely high, like as humanity. And if you look at the development of computers and software and where we are today compared to where we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, like we're living in like this crazy futuristic world already, that nobody in the 80s could have pictured. And then you look at the world of medicine, and yeah, there have been some really amazing innovations, but at the same time, it hasn't really grown that fast. What if it had? Like, where would we be now? How many? We'd have like solutions we'd have cures for just about everything, I think.
Yeah, I have this. It's a parallel platform to the Futurist New Deal. Is a space elevator platform, and I've made this argument. Yeah, I made this argument a few times with a lot of people, and also in print, about the cost of our space program. We've spent $1 trillion+ over the course of some decades on things which did produce a lot of technologies indirectly, but that cost is enormous. And in certain regards, the direct goals of that space program was largely a publicity stunt, $1 trillion publicity stunt.
Right.
For that same amount of money, we could have built an orbital ring or space elevator, at least with industrial capacities. I also believe by this time, you and I could already have condos on the moon, were it not for this short-sighted state-run capitalism.
Wow. Yeah, that's one of those. I don't know. That seems to me, and I know it's probably just being short-sighted, but it seems, I don't know. It's one of those things like, yeah, it seems possible, but would it really be? Would it really be viable? Like, would people really want to go to the moon, being that I mean, like, there's not a whole lot of people that want to go to Death Valley and just kind of hang out. There are a few.
Well,
but
a lot of this specific prospectus that I have worked on, it's for a lower cost industrial space elevator. So it doesn't really relate directly to putting people in the tourism thing. And I would classify space tourism in that same category as these other state publicity stunts, is a kind of thing that a little bit of a dubious goal.
Right.
But the industrial aspects, just being able to clean up the space debris in near Earth orbit, just being able to sooner fix up these data mini satellites, all of and 100 other applications besides, as well.
Absolutely.
That stuff that's opening up potentially multi-trillion-dollar markets that don't exist today, by allowing for mining and allowing for better class of near Earth infrastructure. So ultimately, the goal would be to have that travel and stuff as well. But that's kind of more the icing on the cake, I think.
Right. Actually, so I'm just picturing now. So I've been traveling around the world a lot lately, and I know it's expensive. It's dirty as far as pollution from these huge jets, and it takes a really long time. do you think that there's any way that an elevator would create it would be a longer path, but maybe a quicker path in some way to travel from, opposite ends of the world?
Yes, yes, that's one application of something like that. And the space elevator design that I've worked on, it's the main reason that we don't have this thing on Earth right now is because we don't have materials that are strong enough to build this tether if it's moored on Earth. So the prospectus that I worked on, it's built out from the International Space Station and space infrastructure developed by the U.S. and Russians principally, and it doesn't actually, the tether doesn't actually reach all the way to the Earth. But what it does is it allows for removing that the rocketry, like you mentioned, to some degree from the equation. And that is a great expense and has an environmental impact that's pretty considerable. And removing that, or rather reducing that significantly to a type of rocketry that's not required, that's not the kind that's required to reach such a speed as to escape Earth's gravity, but rather just something more like what you're talking about with ordinary air travel. And that would be the way that you would be shuttling materials up to the space elevator, which would then be using drones to start work to get up there and start working on near Earth infrastructure. But there's other travel possibilities with something like this, aside from merely going to the moon. It could ultimately be itself involved in another shuttle service, a kind of system.
Interesting. Yeah, that stuff's it's all really fascinating. It's it's one of those things, like it seems like sci-fi, but at the same time you have to consider, I mean, I guess technically it is sci-fi until it's actually done, but you have to consider like what we think is normal today was sci-fi 10 years ago. So
Right.
yeah, it's something I'm really excited to see, and
you've talked about your work with essentially replacing Facebook with a decentralized set of protocols. But 15 years ago, we didn't even conceive of the kind of technology that would allow for, everything in your Facebook feed. It's advanced algorithms. It's AI that's allowing that to happen. And the same quick progression of AI will allow us to do something like this in a decentralized framework with just ordinary people having oversight as a group over those systems. So that same principle applies to a lot of things. It might apply to crowdsourcing industrial projects of the kind that we're talking about. It would apply to crowdsourcing government projects, and it's an area which nation states don't always embrace. Estonia is one that is small enough and agile enough, and not in a lot of direct competition with other organizations, government institutions, that's been able to kind of move in that way. But nation states are actively resisting this sort of thing. They don't. Rather than build out entire new markets and possibilities for human beings that would improve their lives, these particular set of politicians and actors are playing a sort of zero-sum game where they want to maintain their base of power to the detriment of the rest of us.
Right. Yeah, it's always about control. And what's interesting is, like Estonia has like the residency. And what's, I'm in Mexico right now. I'm running my campaign from down here. Like where we are in the world, and part of this is like, it's kind of the mindset that we're in. Like I said before, I've always traveled, like even when I was in the US most of the time, I've traveled all over the country, and it's like, why do I need to have an ID from a certain state? Why does my car need to be registered in a certain state if I'm traveling around? And it becomes more apparent even when I was stopped in California with a Mexican driver's license. and they told me that I needed to, if I was going to drive in California, I needed to get a California driver's license. And I told him, well, I'm actually on my way out of the state right now. And he says, well, you need to get a California driver's license. And I'm like, first of all, do I qualify? Am I a resident? You don't know that. You never bothered to ask. Why would I need a California license if I'm leaving the state? It doesn't make any sense. But their concern is kind of like over their control. They know that if I have their driver's license, I am then under their control, their jurisdiction, their contract. And so,
and it's also aside from police state and militarization, these are very real concerns that have escalated over the last few decades, and in the wake of the kind of Patriot Act stuff and other things. But there's also just a very real sense of just nickel and diming working people. You know, the incidents around Ferguson, that was all because police were just dinging everybody 100 times a week, 10 times a month, let's say, you know, with these strange and exorbitant fees. And you know, there's it seems that every aspect of American society, there's something where people are paying a poor tax, and it seems to be pretty intentionally often targeted at people who are the least wealthy people in our society.
And it's so I mean, it's so bad. Just, I mean, there's so many different ways to look at it. One is that a lot of these taxes are hidden, so most people don't know that they're paying them. Like, you don't know when you go, you buy a meal at a restaurant, or you buy a bag of chips, or you're pumping your gas. Like, most people in this country don't know how much gas tax they're paying, even though it's printed right there on the pump usually. Like, there's so many hidden taxes that you don't know you're paying. But then on top of that, like you said, there's like a poor tax. Like, people want the government to come along and help the poor out of poverty, but the reality is everybody's in poverty because of the government. When you look at you know, like you look at what's the basic necessity for survival, right? You have a little bit of land, you have some food that you can grow on it, and you have a shelter, right? That's your necessities. And if you have that, you are at the baseline of survival, and you should be fine, right? Because nature is giving you everything you need. But that's not enough. What's going to happen is the government's going to come along and they're going to say, well, you have to pay a property tax. You need a license for this. You need that. And so now people who are perfectly fine sustaining their own lives outside of the system of government are forced to go get a job and work for the system and collect money to give to the government. And so it's like, it literally is that. It's a poor tax. And some people who are a little bit more well off don't see that, but they're being taxed just the same. It's just that they're above the basic necessity line, so they're not in poverty, and they think like, oh, there must be something wrong with these other people. They're not managing their money right. That's not it at all. They're just being robbed day and night by this government system.
And I think we should at that point we should reiterate something that you and I touched upon a moment ago. These sort of ticket hero type apps. You know, some of these things they're working well, and so municipalities or states they're trying to get rid of them. So, you know, we can't get rid of this predatory tax. We have to get the app that's trying to help people not be nickel and dimed to death. And there's a number of apps. You know, it's a young man in London who developed one of the first of these apps, and it started to go viral. It started to be used in other municipalities, and those municipalities and agencies at a national level were very quick to try and take actions against this sort of thing. I think that's very much the opposite of what we're doing. Anytime we're seeing any kind of network effect that's streamlining some process, we need to be embracing it and promoting it. I think that's, but particularly as it relates to reducing bloat or you know, these kind of the many municipalities across the United States, they get a fair amount of their revenue from speed traps and stuff. And that, you know, it's debatable whether that kind of predatory action is really contributing anything. It's contributing to keeping those police who they're paying to run those speed traps. It's paying their salaries. It's beyond that. What is it actually contributing?
And we see the exact same thing with the drug war. And actually, now that the we see a lot of these like sex trafficking busts lately, whether it's children or adults. And this is where, because the police are there for profit, why weren't they making these busts before? They were busy with the drug war because that was an easy target. You could always plant drugs on people, but it's harder to, trick somebody and make a false arrest on sex trafficking. At the same time, they've got, a few 100,000 untested rape kits with DNA samples in evidence lockers across the country, a few 100,000 of them, and they're just sitting there because there's no money in that. They can't make that bust. But the sex trafficking, there's usually cash around that they can confiscate, that kind of thing. So, it's really interesting to see what crimes they go after, and there's always money associated with it. And that's really, unfortunately, that's the reality. I advocate a lot that people should not rely on government for law enforcement, and we should rely on ourselves and our neighbors. And there are apps that help with that. There's Cell 411. There's different ways to get involved in your own community to make it safe. There was a gentleman in Detroit when the police department actually left. He started policing his own neighborhood because he had training, military training, I think. And there are ways to do this, but you look at government, and they're always trying to justify, oh, get rid of us, you're going to be extremely unsafe. No one's going to protect you from murder. The reality is nobody's trying to murder me. I'm running for president. And if they were, the police are not here like guarding around my house. I have to hire private security, and people are worried like, well, I'm not going to be safe. I'm going to have to pay police if I want justice. But the reality is that's how it works now. It's something that people don't want to think about, but like right now, the police are not there to keep you safe. The Supreme Court and all these other courts have said so many times that's not their job, to protect and serve. It's their job to enforce the law. So it's really telling when you look at the system, but it's this people don't want to get out of this safe world that exists inside of their head to see the harsh reality that we live in, which is extremely unfortunate. But that's part of my campaign, is to help people see that.
Yeah, and that's a very valid point. A lot of these state-run organizations and state capitalist organizations, besides as well as in law enforcement, they don't have that mandate. They're not providing that service. They're not contributing to our welfare and human development to the degree that they should be. That you would think organizations of this kind do. And there's variance. Some countries are a little better at this than we are in their bureaucracies. Right. But it's what I really value. I've spoken to a few, as I mentioned, this is a third of these. I actually spoke to a small L libertarian candidate who doesn't, kind of in a different class. But this was the third of the capital L libertarian debates that I've had. And I have to say, those guys have some of the same bullet points that you have, but you're actually talking about market-based solutions and new technologies to promote these things, to move us into a more fully realized post-industrial society. And I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, speaking of technology, to come back on that last point with technology is tracking. Like, there's in the 90s, LoJack was the thing. You put it on your car so you could always find your car. There have been cases of LoJack, and there's also been cases now where you can track your cell phone like that. So if your cell phone gets stolen, you know exactly where it is. And there have been cases where people call the police and they say, I know where my whether it's my device or my car, I know where it is. I need you to go get it because you're the police. And they'll say, well, sorry, that's not our job, or we don't have the resources for that. Why don't you have the resources for that? Well, because they're patrolling around looking for drugs and traffic tickets and other things that they can make money off of.
Yeah. And almost everybody, maybe not having that extreme of an experience, but I had e-bike stolen not too long ago, electronic bicycle. And I didn't contact the police. There was no insurance claim to be made. And I even had some inkling of the parties that could have potentially been responsible. But I did not believe that the police would take any realistic steps to recover that property. And
I actually, I had a motorcycle stolen out of my parking lot, and that one I reported because it's all it was, well, I don't think it was registered, but it had VIN numbers and all this other crap. So I was like, well, let me just call the police and see what they do. I guess this was before I was as detached as I am now. They found it a few days later and they gave me a call and told me to go pick it up. And I was like, wow, that's so wonderful. And I'm thinking in my head, I'm going to go donate like, $200 or $300 to the department because like they saved me a lot of money. I feel like I should repay them. And this is how I think society should function. Well, because they weren't worried about getting paid from me because they were getting their paycheck anyway. I was trying to get a ride over to where the motorcycle was. I got a call from a friend, or he was going to take me. He was just on his way. Then the police called back and said, "Are you coming?" And I was like, "Yeah. Are you waiting on me?" And they're like, "Yeah. If you're not here in 5 minutes, it's going on the tow truck." And I was like, "Wait a minute! Like nobody told me I had a deadline. Nobody told me any of this." So and I had a car. Like I was just waiting. If I go there with my car, I can't drive it back. So I drove there, and it's already 5 minutes later, it's already up on the tow truck. They took it away. They wrecked it, putting it on the tow truck. It was in better condition when they found it, and then I had to pay the tow company the money that I was going to give to the police. So it's really interesting to see like where their incentives are, and like even when they actually do their job, like with the expectation that we have, they still manage to screw it up because the incentive is not there to help me. They're just doing their job and like, hey, I can't sit around here all day. I need to get donuts, and I have really bad communication. I'm not going to tell him he's got 10 or 15 minutes to get down here. So it's just really interesting to see all that.
Yeah. I like your hat.
Thank you.
I appreciate your willingness to pursue this campaign in this way. It takes a lot of bravery, and as I said, there's so many areas in which we can be resisting concerns about the flaws in our system. But I'd like to play the devil's advocate for a moment.
Okay.
Around 1980, a gentleman who's still living named Charles Koch, he ran for the president, and on essentially a taxation is theft campaign, and on the Libertarian ticket, I should add. And the campaign was unsuccessful, but in the intervening years, he could be described as the most politically successful right libertarian activist in history, developing this Koch network, which in many ways is the tail that wags the dog of the two-party system today. And some of the things that he's managed to implement, it's in hindsight questionable whether this is good outcomes for the middle class. In the 1950s in the United States, we had about half of people working in manufacturing jobs that paid $35 an hour, adjusting for inflation. Today, we have 55% of people working in service jobs with artificially low wages and artificially high living costs. A system of slavery. How do you address this? The mistakes that have been made on the part of right libertarians or on our society. It's good to talk about freedom, but sure, people cannot be free if they're living as wage slaves.
Right. So, and that's a really interesting point that I actually like to talk about. So we think of slavery as, forcing someone in shackles to work someplace, right? They're captive. They're like, they're kidnapped, right? They can't leave. That's what we think of. But when you think about a slave owner, like, what do they really want? Do they really want to hold other people captive, or do they really want free labor? And if you think about how this system is that we have, right? I talked earlier about how, even if you have your basic necessities, that's not enough. You need to work just to keep those. And so if let's say you have, let's say you have a city or a town of 10,000 people, and they're all just fine, right? They don't have a government. They kind of grow their own crops. They trade. Some of them grow chickens and pigs and, whatever. They all have, their necessities taken care of, and they live a fine, normal life. Now, somebody comes into that town and says, hey, we're going to charge you a property tax, and it's because there's some foreign military that wants to invade and blow up your village. just because you live next to us, but it's okay because we've built this military that's going to protect you, but you need to pay us a property tax, and you need to pay us. Oh, you guys are trading with each other. Every time you trade, you need to give us some of that. And so next thing you know, they're extracting all of the wealth out of this little town. And so now this town is they have nothing left. They've given all of this to government, and the government's still saying, well, you still got to pay the property tax, or else we're going to kick you out and build a mall. We're going to kick you out and sell the land to somebody who has money that can build a mall. Well, so what are they going to do? They want to keep their house? Well, they have to actually go into town now and find a factory, and they have to work in order to just get a little bit of money to go pay their property tax so they can keep what they already had before the government even came around. Now, what this does, if you think about this, is basic law of economic supply and demand. You now have another 10,000 people from this village who are desperate for work, not because they want to improve their lives by finding a job doing something that they like. They're forced to work because they have to raise money to pay a tax, and there's no other way they can raise it now. This creates the slavery. These people would not need to work in a factory. But if you look at the factory owner and he's like, well, hey, all these people, they're living fine. They have all their necessities taken care of. And I have my factory, but I don't have any workers in it. How can I convince them to come work for me? I can offer them money, but maybe they don't want the money because they're happy the way they are. So how do you convince them, like, hey, the labor pool is too small. Either I'm going to have to pay a lot of money, or I'm not going to have enough people in my factory. What do? You make friends with people in the government to create these taxes. You don't look like the bad guy because you're not robbing them, the government is. And now these people are forced to work. So it is a system of slavery. I completely agree with that. But it's more complicated than just like you're not a slave owner because you're offering money in exchange for somebody. If you're really the evil side of this is what happens in government. And I'm sure there are plenty of corporations who are, the money gets swapped around all the time, right? The government's taking all the tax from these people, and then not only are the big companies like, let's say, Amazon or Walmart benefiting from cheap labor, now they're actually going to say, hey, if you give us money, we'll open another plant in another city. So now they're actually being subsidized by the stolen money, and it just gets around like that. So it's not to say that every company that starts up that's exchanging money for labor is evil. But there are definitely these nasty components around this that are slavery, that are theft, that are creating this system that are forcing labor. When the reality is we should be leaning towards automation. We should be looking towards a future where we don't have jobs. Nobody has jobs because machines are doing everything for us. And I don't see that as a bad thing. It's just that this system of taxation that we live in is what's making that a bad thing. One more thing I want to say is that slave owners were always obsessed with keep them working, keep them working, keep them working. What did they want? They wanted 100% employment, right? 0% unemployment rate. And what's the government always talking about? Unemployment rate. How do you get the unemployment rate down to 0? That shouldn't be the focus. We should be worried about our lives, our personal lives, our family, our leisure time. That's what we should be worried about. Why is it that our technology is so far advanced today, and yet we have to spend more man hours working just to sustain what we could have sustained 100 years ago with just a few hours a week?
Yeah, and in those productivity gains, there have been studies that say that, well, I mean, the arithmetic is fairly simple. If we had seen the increases in wages and general human development and well-being that we've seen in terms of productivity advances, we would have basically the wage would have quintupled but it's been frozen, and it's effectively at the same level that it's been, despite those dramatic increases in productivity. And the argument that you make about this sort of mafia protections racket type government is a compelling one, and we shouldn't discredit that or the many flaws in our system. But there's also the fact remains that there's not an example of a developed society that operates on the model that we're describing here. That an affluent society is very much a feature of moving out of these proto markets and allowing for more complex contracts and relationships and things like this. And the United States is not the paragon of that. We have some more state-run and oligarchic type forces, and the imperialist kind of draining of resources, the Pentagon bloat that you mentioned in that example as well. But there are countries that seem to do a little bit better a job of it. There are no countries where no tax revenue is taken that live well. How do we get there?
Well, I think we're looking at two things, right? There's always cause and or correlation and causality. You know, I went to some some places in Africa that, you know, most people didn't have a lot of money, and you look there and there aren't a whole lot of taxes, but there are taxes, and the little taxes that they have hurt them a lot. In Uganda, they implemented I think it was like 5 cents per day social media tax. And because of this 5 cents per day tax, you know, we're used to spending, you know, what, like anyone will spend, you know, 20, 40, $100 a month on internet. And we're talking about 5 cents, and that knocked, I think it was either 10 million or 30 million people offline. They couldn't use social media because they couldn't afford that 5 cents per day tax. And when you look at this, it's like, okay, if let's say you're a tyrant and you want to rob millions of people at a time, do you go to a place where nobody has anything, or do you go to an affluent society where everybody's got lots of money and they're worried about protecting it, and then you can sell them protection? And I think that's what the correlation is. But it's not, the taxes don't create that wealth. They, you know, if anything, it's friction against that economy. So it slows down the creation of wealth. But the taxes always appear where the wealth is, because there's no point in creating a tax where there is no wealth or where there is no money. There's nothing to take.
The Libertarian candidate for president in 2016, Gary Johnson, he was in a field with a few other candidates who were a higher profile at the beginning of that campaign, at the beginning of this primary events in the Libertarian. He ended up being the sort of dark horse candidate who was selected. And one might argue that was because while he's advocating for these kinds of changes that we're talking about, he's allowing for, in the near term, the continued existence of certain kinds of social programs. Not saying on January 21st, 2017, I will dissolve the federal government or remove all tax regulations. How do you convince people that this is a serious minded thing to do?
So the way I look at it, you're absolutely right. We can't shut it down in one day, because the reality is a lot of people are dependent on it, and it would be like, you know, pulling someone off of a heroin needle and they go into withdrawals and they can die from that. You don't want to do that. You want to wean them off. I look at it like, you know, this is a dam that has been built, and it's got, you know, just a massive amount of water behind it. And if you were to just, like, you know, blow up the dam, then all the water would come through at once. The water levels would go too high. You'd see a lot of damage of wildlife. You'd kill a lot of animals. You might destroy some houses. There's so much damage that can be done from that. But if you start releasing the water slowly and you let the water come down and reach an equilibrium, then you can take the dam away without causing all of this damage. So that's kind of the way that I see this system working. We need some sort of transition into that system. One great example is the FDA. The FDA restricts use of drugs. We talked about right to try. There's plenty of other issues that we have. Like, there are medications that are approved for sale in other countries, and it's illegal for us to import them. Why is that? The FDA is supposedly there for our safety, and yet they're telling us, sorry, even though this drug is considered safe in another country, you can go to that country and take it, but you can't have that imported here and take it. It doesn't seem like they're really after our safety. But if we were to recognize the FDA as a monopoly, and we were to break up that monopoly and allow competition, you know, we don't want to shut it down on day one, because people are still depending on, hey, is this FDA approved? But if we say, okay, look, a couple years from now, 2 years, five years from now, we're going to allow all drugs to be sold as long as it's stamped with a certification of someone, then that kind of opens the market for new companies to start forming and people to start getting together, gathering investors, and setting up a plan of criteria so that they can test their own drugs separate from what the FDA does. And then when you go to the market, you can say, okay, do I want this $5,000 pill that's approved by the FDA, or do I want the $50 pill that's approved by Google or, you know, some Silicon Valley company? That's really the choice that we should be able to have.
And it's very difficult to tease out these regulatory bodies and the role in which they're playing in what they believe to be this more commonplace kind of regulation versus our nation's criminalization of substances, which is quite arbitrary. You know, there's public health concerns that derive from the use of some of these substances that are criminalized, but we're not addressing those concerns with the war on drugs. We're making people's lives worse
Right.
rather than making them better in an attempt to intervene. And that's one of the points of the Futurist New Deal, is some approach to decriminalization of all of these substances, and certainly the softer substances, full legalization beyond. But yeah, I think that just a more a healthy-minded attitude to those things will probably lead to more productive approaches to regulations of these new drugs coming down the pipeline that actually are intended to save people's lives, and things which are stymied for 5 years, 15 years in some cases, rather than being made available. And you know, as mentioning the techno sluggishness again, this is the biggest concern that techno-optimists, transhumanists in the transhumanist party, one of the biggest concerns that they have, that maybe people in the two-party system don't have as much, is that we can't just let these things become orphan technologies that are left by the wayside because we don't have the ability to adapt to the speed in which they're being produced as a society, as a nation. We need to be integrating all of them into, and that requires a kind of agility that we haven't had in the 20th century, and we haven't had a mandate to have in the early 21st century to the degree that I believe that we should. And it comes down to things like what you're saying, decentralization, and disrupting marketplaces, and allowing for change of this kind. The Futurist New Deal, it's largely an e-governance and a reform package that increases some kinds of benefits. We have a federal land dividend where we are leasing federal lands, which are, as you know, are held in great number by the United States. They're not being used. Some of those are being used in the form of national parks. We would leave those alone. But these other 85% of federal lands, they can be leased to carbon neutral companies that agree to a certain kind of aesthetic, and to return them when they're finished with them in the form that they were. But in doing so, we can generate a large number of revenue. Our numbers say $173 trillion over 10 years. Which would be enough to fund a basic income that would be effectively, you know, it's not conceived as other social programs of the 20th century. It would effectively be a stopgap to get us to this world that we're describing, where we now have effectively fuller automation. We have new marketplaces. We're able to move from those people in service jobs who are losing their jobs, those truck drivers who are having their jobs automated out of existence. We need some kind of cushion. A lot of those people, they're not going to take it lying down that they no longer have jobs, because thanks to Silicon Valley, all of those truck drivers have a shotgun in a case somewhere or something. They're not going to accept that they no longer have a way to support their families. And the idea of a basic income, it's something that in some ways is able to fix the problems of the welfare state and the failings of this bureaucracy-driven, red tape-driven kind of thing. but it is controversial. Ours is funded differently from Andrew Yang, Democratic presidential campaign candidate running on a basic income. Ours is less prone to hyperinflation and other concerns that would be coming from fiscal conservatives because we're drawing from this novel revenue stream. How do you feel about a stopgap for healthcare or for basic income until such time as we're really approaching a truly minarchist and full automation society?
Sure. So I think there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but it's what happens is, you talk about getting to a decentralized society, but at the same time, you're moving more towards a centralized society when you create a program that everybody's going to be dependent on. So let me just go through and point out a couple few fallacies or what I think are fallacies in this plan. First is federal land. What makes that federal land? Basically, some politicians came around and circled a map and said, hey, this is ours. That land belonged to other people before. They were kicked off. If you look at okay, if here's the United States and there's not a single human being on it, and then you have people come from another country and say, hey, we're going to make this our land. What right do they have to claim that much land? Can they just say all of it's ours and we'll decide how to divide it? So the next people that come over are going to have to buy it from us? Or do you have some sort of process of claiming land where you say, okay, you can claim, a few acres or a couple hundred acres, like whatever's reasonable to the land that you can actually take care of. But no person in the world in their right mind would think that they can just step onto a new piece of land that's, 1,000,000 acres and say, this is mine. I'm going to build a little house on one corner of it, but I have 1,000,000 acres. It doesn't make any sense. But somehow when the government does it, it does. And that's only because they have a military to back it up. So I would argue it's not really their land to sell. But the fact that there is all that land does mean that people should be able to travel to that land and homestead it, and they shouldn't be charged a tax. Now, when you look at the
I don't think
UBI,
that
what's that?
I don't think that this lease program would interfere with people, and there are people who do this to some degree. I would agree. Adam Kokesh made this point, and I think that we should allow for this homesteading and sharing. But the fact remains, these lands were nationalized a century ago, and no one is making a direct claim. And at that time, there was the population in the U.S. was a lot smaller. Right. There weren't as many of the same issues with those lands being controlled in this way, and largely it was under the guise of some kind of aesthetic concerns or environmental concerns, even at that time, and a different time in terms of environmentalist concerns. But people still wanted to have some preservation. The Audubon Society was the organization that worked most closely, I believe, with Teddy Roosevelt in promoting this idea that these lands should be protected. So it wasn't specifically an effort towards state-run capitalism or a kind of power play that other nationalization efforts have been.
Sure.
But there's always going to be concerns about legitimate authority, and we should be doing anything that we can to question people's assumptions about this. But I think that concerns about freedom, they do concern me. It concerns me that people are forced to pay taxes against their will. At the same time, concerns of 100,000 people a year in the United States dying for a lack of reasonable quality of life or healthcare, market failings. That's a real thing. That's not an abstract.
Absolutely. Well, so let me switch over to healthcare for a minute. One of my healthcare plan is actually called free healthcare. And it's free as in freedom. But the idea is basically, like if you look at like the socialized healthcare, basically what you're saying is you're going to tax maybe the middle class, maybe the upper class, whoever you're going to tax, you're going to take this money from them. You're going to give it to a lower class so that they can now afford this expensive healthcare. and they're going to give that money to these companies, which is now going to go to big pharma and big hospitals and all these big medical corporations that are going to make tons of money. Now, on top of that, whenever a bank dumps money into a market, like we saw this we see this now with the college market, when banks are dumping in money, the prices just inflate like crazy. We saw it with the housing market in 2008, banks dumping a ton of money in, prices go up. We see the same thing with the whales in Bitcoin. They dump a ton of money into one specific coin, and the price goes way up. This is just an economic law, and the same thing is going to happen when you tax people to give to them to give to other people to pay for healthcare. Is the companies are going to say, oh well, all these guys are able to afford this healthcare now, let's raise the prices. Instead, what the free healthcare system would be is let's eliminate all the monopolies that they have, which is in deregulating the FDA, allowing competition with that, allowing more people to practice medicine. We have doctors here from India and the Philippines who are they're fully qualified, trained doctors with experience, and they're not allowed to practice here because of laws that prohibit them. They have to go back to, they don't have to do the whole medical school, but they have to do a lot of it. And you get rid of all that, and all of a sudden you have more doctors, you have more innovations, you have new medications that are actually curing diseases and not just treating them and prolonging them. And so what happens is you see the cost of healthcare go from, oh my God, I need $5,000 a month to pay for health insurance, down to, oh, I can just go to the doctor and pay cash and it costs me $100 a month. And we're already starting to see a lot of doctors that are doing this in their own practices where they're not taking insurance anymore. They're charging their patients, $50 or $100 a month, and they can come in for as many visits as they want. We're seeing all kinds of programs like this, and they work. But even then, the doctors can't get 90% off on the medications that are all going to big pharma profits. So with the socialized healthcare, the issue is that the big corporations are still making their profit. But with the free healthcare model, the corporations actually don't make that profit because now there's competition and they can't inflate their prices. So that's where I see solving that problem. But going back to the UBI, when you have, I look at like the net effect, right? So let's say each person wants to get $1,000 a month. Well, the reality is somebody who's making, $30,000 or $40,000 a year is already paying $1,000 a month in taxes, not just their income tax, but they're paying their property tax, they're paying gas tax, they're paying electric tax, their cell phone tax, taxes on all their foods and licensing for everything. It's an insane amount of taxes. And if you look at that and say, well, hey, what's this money going on? And what's this money being spent for? And you realize that the government's wasting like 99% of everything that we give them, then you can say, well, instead of like me paying $1,000 a month in taxes and you giving me back $1,000, why don't you just stop taxing me? And then you don't need that money. And then this goes back to the idea that, once you have your necessities taken care of, you don't need an income. You can survive without an income, and that's how we were. We've kind of become dependent on that. But now that jobs have become like the norm, we don't look at it that way anymore. We look at it like, no, we have to have a job. That's just part of life. But it's not. It never was.
Well, in a basic income system, that would be, people. Then that's the thing. All the studies on basic income systems. People who fearmonger about this, they say that people will drop out of the workforce. That happens at a rate of about 1%, and that's people who have small children. Everybody else, the only sense in which they drop out of the workforce is that they are starting new businesses and engaging in jobs where they were miserable to find work that they would actually enjoy or find productive.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't even argue that point because personally myself, if I had an extra $1,000 a month, I would just say, hey, I'm making an extra $1,000 a month. I wouldn't quit my job because why make only 1,000 when you can make 2 or 5 or 10?
Well, the Andrew Yang's basic income is $12,000 a year, $1,000 a month. The Futurist New Deal, funded by this $173 trillion, would be $1,000 a week, a $52,000 minimum income per year. So it's a little bit different. You mentioned in the context of healthcare and also this job marketplace, this idea that lower wage people are essentially robbing the middle class in the form of these programs, and I share that concern. But that's not the full picture of what's happened over the course of the last quarter of the 20th century and into the 21st century. In 2017, a tax reform was passed, which resulting in Amazon paying no taxes this last year. The Koch network. These are the guys who are as much robbing and more so robbing the middle class by gaming the tax system.
I don't think I would characterize it as the lower class stealing from the middle class as much as I would I mean, that's how the money gets shifted around. But if I were to really characterize it in terms of who's stealing from who, I would say it is the upper class. It is the elites who are stealing from both and giving a little bit back to the guy at the bottom just so that he can support his political policies. So he's kind of like buying the votes.
Yeah.
But ultimately, yeah, you're right. Everybody's getting robbed except for the people at the top who are, making hundreds of billions of dollars and not paying any taxes. But I mean, if you think about it, it makes total sense because it's those people at the top who created these taxes in the first place. Why would they tax themselves? I mean, one thing that always seemed kind of paradoxical to me was, why do people in the military pay income tax? Like, it doesn't make any sense because it's like, okay, so you're giving me money from the treasury, but then I have to give some of it back. Like, it doesn't make any sense. If you were to tax business, arguably that makes a little bit more sense because it's money going into the treasury. But now you're just, why not just pay them less? Well, what's the scam here?
And it wasn't always. Those policies did shift over the decades. Similarly, taxing Social Security started to happen in the 1980s under the Reagan presidency. It was the same sort of thing. It was just a sort of a bit of chicanery to fund the first wave of these huge tax cuts for the Charles Kochs and the Jeff Bezoses. It's good that I think it's a distinction that the other candidates I did not talk to were willing to make, that we want to work towards these greater libertarian and decentralization efforts, but we also need to recognize that some certain approaches to this and kinds of these efforts are having the opposite effect. Creating an overclass, a group of overlords, and a powerful oligarchic class that are able to manipulate the system. It's one of the points of the futurist New Deal is getting rid of Citizens United, these other dark money mechanisms that allow these people who have many tens of billions of dollars to influence the political system in secret. And similarly, we want to get rid of ALEC, this law writing body that serves much the same function, passing staunchly pro-corporatist laws that don't benefit people. And these laws are just these pieces of writing are just fed to legislators, and rather so that they don't write anything themselves. They don't support their constituents' wishes. They're just basically working for Koch Industries. This is in some degree it's a direct result of right libertarian policies. I think we need a kind of more intersectionalist libertarian approach. It's driven more by decentralization, but that has make some concessions to the needs of ordinary people and how. And the mistakes that we've made starting in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I think, I mean, those are some interesting points you bring up. Obviously, I hate the idea of money in politics, but I think that, when we talk about like, how do we fix a problem, right? We can fix a symptom of the problem, or we can fix the problem itself. And we have to kind of realize what's what. And when I look at government and Citizens United and all these things, and money going into politics, I look at look at the internet. There's exchanges of information that the smartest minds in the world have been trying to stop in terms of BitTorrents and movie piracy and blockchain and all these other things. They want to stop these technologies, but they can't. So at some point, you're going to have to realize no law that you can create is going to stop money from getting to where it's going to go. It's, even if you have all these laws, even if all the banks are, you don't need a warrant to search all the records, they'll find a way to transfer money into the right place. But instead of seeing that as the problem, I see that as the symptom, where the real problem is, why does government have a power that they can sell in the first place? Because if you look at that, I mean, what if the government had no power? Then how much money would be in politics? Absolutely none. Because really, when somebody donates $100 million to a president, what do they expect? They expect certain privileges, right? They expect their business to not be taxed. They expect the laws to change to allow them to create a monopoly. They expect all these special privileges on being the sole importer of something, or being able to import, to change a law that allows them to import or export something. This is what the money does. But if you take that power away from government in the first place, what's there to buy? Absolutely nothing. It's like, if you walked into an empty store with $100 million in your pocket, what are you going to buy? Nothing, because there's nothing on the shelf to buy. And so we need to stop looking at the money in politics as the issue and start looking at the fact that these governments are able to do that to us in the first place. And we as people need to recognize it for what it is and be able to say, no, this isn't going to happen anymore. We're not going to allow this. This needs to stop. And when that happens, nobody's going to pay a politician who has no power.
And this is one of my biggest pet peeves. It's something that people who are supporters of the two-party system often point to. So the Futurist New Deal, it's perhaps second most controversial initiative beyond the basic income, is an I-voting system. And it's not the sort of thing that we're technologically incapable of. And people often, people in this Democratic Party who I speak to, for example, often point to the failings of our current automated voting systems, which are very different, very different kinds of systems. There's no, only a few municipalities have even attempted to have e-voting in the United States, but it's one of my biggest pet peeves that people are unwilling to consider allowing this, and that let me talk a little bit about blockchain voting. So I interviewed a guy who's a thought leader in this area. He's a guy from Australia who founded the Flux Party, a blockchain voting and post-partisan kind of organization. They just want to overlay these technologies onto the system. They're not specifically advancing any particular agenda, except a techno-progressive kind of a technological leap. And his point was that Australia's a little smaller than the United States, admittedly, but he can manage all of this voter data from his Macintosh computer. And although he doesn't have every piece of that, every step of that, which a lot of that is out there. There's you can some of it's even open source, those kind of protocols. But the point is, many people in the United States, they say this technology is not reasonable. We would be at the mercy of hackers. Estonia hasn't had that problem to any real degree, to the point where they would consider getting rid of that system. And the main problem the United States has is not somebody in Macedonia or Nigeria hacking their voting system. The main problem is that politicians and lobbyists are effectively able to burn the ballot box or stuff the ballot box at every single election at the behest of people like the Charles Koch network. There's a huge amount of voter disenfranchisement and suppression and manipulation of all kinds. That's a real problem, and we have the ability to create a direct democracy. We have the ability to take this first step, which would then lead to a domino effect, I believe, that would move us towards a more decentralized set of institutions of this kind. And we're not doing it. It's a little bit like it's a little bit like somebody at the turn of the 20th century saying that they would never use a car because their horse is working just fine. It's
Right.
the wrong attitude to solving these problems. It's incredibly short-sighted.
Well, I hear all the time from people that are like, yeah, we need, in Texas, we have an electronic voting system. And a lot of people there are pissed off and they're like, we need to go back to paper ballots. I talk to them to try to figure out why, because I'm obviously a fan of technology. And the one thing that they are concerned with is that they're just pressing a button on a box and their vote's not being counted. So what I'd really like to see in any kind of voting system, and actually I made kind of a proof of concept of this a couple of years ago. It wasn't blockchain based, but when you would basically get, you would enter your vote and you'd have a unique ID, basically like a number. And this could be like a private key or, whatever in a blockchain. And what you could do is after the votes are counted, you'd be able to go back to some website or download some software that operates on this protocol, and just like you can verify the total votes that are counted by seeing that the blockchain verifies, you'd be able to put in your own number and verify that your actual vote was correctly counted in that blockchain. And I think that's
Estonia does it.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that's like the electronic systems we have now. You don't even get a receipt. So I think if
incredible graft deriving just from that fail, an incredible graft.
Right. Well, the other thing too is, like,
I don't want to call out your state or any particular states, but there's states that watchdog agencies are looking at and they're saying you don't actually have a functioning democracy anymore because of this kind of problem.
Right. Well, I mean, your receipt could be also taken with your phone. Like, it can be a picture of a QR code or something. That's, now you have the ID in your phone and you don't have to worry about that. There are ways to do it. But of course, they have a law in Texas now where you're not allowed to take a picture of your ballot after you voted on this machine, but for whatever reason. I don't know. But
we don't want to have too much transparency in the system, even if it's just some improvised thing. And that the Estonians, they do have basically a two-factor system. Where you would vote most generally from a desktop, and then you can verify it from your phone. So by using that two-factor element, it removes, again, another potential exploit on the part of hackers. And but there's there's 1,000 ways that you can approach this sort of thing that builds a reasonable amount of security into the system. These same people who are saying we could never build this system, which ultimately would be cost, in the longer term, would be costing pennies on the dollar compared to the.
Well, hey, but then there's no money to make, right?
Right. But the people who are saying, oh, we could never, it wouldn't be secure enough. They haven't stopped using Amazon 20 times a day.
Right. Putting their credit card in online, and yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, fundamentally, that's the same kind of system that we're talking about. And it's being utilized by more people. So, I don't get it.
Yeah, I think like I said, like we were talking about electricity, like, people need to kind of shift into that mindset. They need to try something and experience it. And hearing about it, like, I remember the first few times I heard about Bitcoin and I was like, that sounds really stupid. But like when you actually experience it, it takes your mind into a different place. So it's the same thing with electricity, the same thing with cars. We talked about so many technological advances. I think that's really the key. And it might not even be that they have to experience it. It might even just need to be that, we need to see it like a Super Bowl commercial or something where like 1 million people see it and they're like, hey, wow, that's a great idea. And they see that, oh, wow, you can verify your receipt. So that your vote is counted and basically address all of their fears and say, like, this isn't good. This is going to be better than what we have. I think, I think we'll get there eventually, but we have to figure out how to get over that fear. And I think, a president, not just a presidential candidate, but an elected president who's actually advocating for that, I think would be a huge help to advance that. I mean, it was a president who advocated creating NASA, right?
Andrew Yang is a relative dark horse, but he is a mainstream candidate. He's somebody who I think has that relationship to advanced technology, is effectively that would be that sort of techno-progressive president. So I do. He's not just a at first glance he might appear to be a one issue candidate with the basic income, but he actually has a lot of policy things. And many of those things, the basic income that we've described. Conservative economists like Milton Friedman was very much in favor of it. In the way that it would maybe fix some of the problems with the welfare state and revitalize the economy. It's not simply something that appeals to this narrow segment of the political compass. There's a lot of arguments to be made for it across that spectrum. Stay with me for a second. I want to. There's an operation in California that's basically run by the PayPal mafia guys, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and their friends, and it's an AI safety initiative, artificial intelligence safety initiative, and they're concerned that what could effectively be sort of a leapfrog technology, let's say developed by China or someone else, a master key that would allow for a lot of institutions to be disrupted or kind of unlocked, a set of algorithms that's able to hack systems beyond anything that exists. They're concerned about this. They're concerned about other advanced algorithms having other disruptive effects. It's funny to me that these guys who've made billions of dollars on this mantra of move fast and break things are now concerned with someone else who might be able to move faster and break their things. But I think it's interesting that these guys are concerned with this because that very technology, that very ability to do something like that could be very much the basis for something that we were talking about earlier, this more decentralized set of social networks, this more decentralized set of government services that's able to provide the things that we expect in developed countries, but in a more voluntarist and more full automation framework. So I kind of Peter Thiel's not my favorite guy. He's arguably the most politically successful transhumanist alive, but he's some of the things, some of his approaches to state to monopolism and some other things I do kind of don't quite sit right with me. But on the other hand, he has contributed to an area that's maybe closest to transhumanists, which is life extensionism, longer lifespans. And I think that's something we could talk about in the context of I mentioned that I think that a public health service should be a stopgap, even if we build a more robust public health service at a national level now, that's not the end game. The end game is to be utilizing these things which exist in prototype form, things which are effectively personalized medicine 3D pill printers for the home, or basically what's a tricorder, advanced algorithms that are able to diagnose and maintain your health at a level that don't require the system that exists that we utilize now. Just 2 months ago, Apple released an iWatch, which now has greater health monitoring capacities and monitoring your heart and that sort of thing. All of these kind of things will lead to a system where we can maintain a health, ideally indefinitely, but certainly to a greater degree than we do now, again, for pennies on the dollar. And that should be the end game. But if we remove those systems, if we don't strengthen those systems, that's maybe hundreds of thousands or 1 million people in that decade who don't survive to see those breakthroughs that are those more decentralized approaches.
Right, but I think that you're kind of proving the point that these private companies are going to create those, and it's government's not advancing any of this technology. If anything, they're slowing it down. So I think you're right that is the end game. But I think it's private innovation that's going to get us there, and the government, the FDA, these restrictive laws that are, we talk about like cannabis is illegal, so we can't research it. What other types of research, like, because research doesn't really happen best in a vacuum, right? You collaborate between different universities and how fast would this accelerate if we had all of the brightest minds in the world working together? And how much is that not happening because of government regulation, and as far as, what things are legal in one place and illegal somewhere else, so experiments can't be done, all sorts of different things. So, I think what Apple's doing is great, what all these companies are doing is great, but there's so many companies that are like, hey, we have this really great idea, it could actually cure this disease. But when you're the investor who's going to put up well, hey, we got to come up with $100 million so that we can pay the FDA to approve it. And then you're telling me it's going to cure people, you do the math on it, how much money you're going to make on a return on that product. It's very small. It's not that $100 million that it's going to cost to pay off the FDA. But if you get rid of the FDA and you say, oh, well, this invention is going to cost $5 or $10 million, and we can develop it, and then we'll be able to take it to market, then it becomes worth the investment. So, there's a lot of unseen things that we don't even know about that are just not even on the table because of the government expense.
And before 1974, it was illegal to profit. This high level profiteering was completely illegal. And so you didn't see, it was a different technological framework, but you didn't see this sapping of public health resources in various sectors and in these public health systems in the way that, you have huge golden parachutes in the industry and pharma, in the insurance industry and big pharma. That's every one of those parachutes represents hundreds of deaths, people who that money could have been used to save their lives.
Right. And look, I'd get rid of any system that's going to. So here's another thing, right? Some of these companies they have these toxic drugs that are killing people, and they rush them to market. And a lot of times they're actually protected from lawsuit because we're FDA approved. You knew the risk. Sorry. And the reality is there are other drugs that would treat the same disease even better, and those aren't allowed to market because the profit margins are going to be smaller and everything else. But when you look at, you talk about like, how are we going to, let's make it illegal for a company to make a lot of profit. That's just trying to treat a symptom of the real disease. The symptom is that there's a monopoly and they're able to charge these insane prices. If you get rid of the monopoly, you don't need a law to protect them from making these profits. They just won't be able to. It won't be a profitable business for them to be in, it will be a profitable business, but they won't be able to make these insane rates, like that pill that went from like $7 to $700 a pill. That won't happen if there's competition. Look at the price of Tylenol. And compare that to, and I know Tylenol, it's an old drug, but I mean, if you think about like, what did it come up with? Like what happened? What did people go through to discover and procure Tylenol in the form that it's in now, and make it so that it's exact dosage in every single pill, and all these other things, and all the testing that they did to see the treatments of it. That was a whole process, and that pill is still like, a couple dollars for like 50 pills. And compare that to the cost of new medications that are coming out. And it's not because these medications are that much more advanced. I mean, they are more advanced, but we also have, the amount of research that goes into it is not that much more advanced, because we have machines and technology that can do all of this for us. So why is it that a Tylenol pill costs almost nothing, and then you have all these other these other medications which you need to buy or you're going to die that cost so much? And the answer is monopolies. You can go to another country. I think it was the hepatitis B pill is something like a couple $100 in the US, and it's like $5 in India, and it's not subsidized. Why is that? It's because there's a monopoly. And that's really just what it is. If you break down all the monopolies, there's, if you're wandering through the desert and I have a cup of ice water, I could sell that to you for $1,000. But if there's some other guy standing next to me, with a whole table full of ice waters, I'm not going to be able to sell it to you for $1,000. And that's the system that we have with healthcare. It's just the one guy in the middle of the desert with that one cup of ice water. And of course, anyone is, especially when it's our lives, it's not like a new computer where like, oh yeah, I don't really need that right now. It's no, you need to buy this or you're going to die. And there's only one place you can buy it from. That's how they're able to charge these prices. So we don't need another law to fix that. We need to get rid of the monopoly so that people are able to have choices and say, well, you're ripping me off. I'm going to go over here and buy from this other guy who's not going to rip me off.
Again, there's an internal logic there and a basic organizing principle that I can respect. But the fact remains that countries that have attempted to do this deregulatory kind of effort, they've had spotty success. The companies that have a national health service, the people are not always excited about it, but they're receiving the level of care that people in the United States might not necessarily be guaranteed. There's but we were talking a few minutes ago about Peter Thiel, and at the beginning of this discussion, we were talking about NASA, particularly the idea that NASA was kind of not a great return on investment for that $1.3 trillion just to kind of take some pictures of flags and on the moon and that sort of thing. But that's not the whole story. This is also an example of a state-run monopoly starting to sound like Peter Thiel here, producing certain kinds of technologies, the integrated computing technologies, the GPS technologies, 100 things that making this conversation possible, derived from these DARPA projects and these high-level research that and somebody, the father of contemporary transhumanism, Ray Kurzweil, would make the argument that those technologies would have come in a few years, maybe not in the United States, maybe we wouldn't have profited from it as directly, but all of that stuff was inevitable, that it would come in within 5 or 10 years, irrespective of what DARPA was doing. But there's a lot of arguments about what we should do coming from you're not I'm not singling you out, but other libertarian candidates that I spoke to, that I don't think that they're taking into account this post-industrial society that's derived from nuanced approaches to all of these things, whether that's regulation or deregulation. And ultimately, the thing that we all want is for people to live well and be more free, and principally for nation states to be less abusive entities. I really thank you for coming on here and talking with me, because, as I said, the main thing that we can do is try to reform these systems and introduce new institutions and approaches to these things. And I think of all of the candidates that I spoke to, you're a person who understands these functions and these goals. So I thank you again. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your platform?
Yeah, let me go with the legalized pineapple pizza. That's actually on there. It's a joke, but it's nobody has the right to tell you what you can or can't put in your own body. And what's actually fun about this one is we get to debate authoritarianism without actually having an actual subject. So you'll notice, like, when a lot of people have discussions, especially about healthcare, it can get very emotional. And somebody will, they'll argue that, hey, we need some sort of healthcare system, and they're sold on a certain one, and you can't argue against them because they've got a sick grandmother or they're sick themselves. And so the legalized pineapple pizza is really, it's a great way to have a conversation with kind of like a proxy argument, if you will. And it's nobody has a right to tell you what you can or can't put in your own body. And I may not agree with what you put on your pizza, but I will defend to the death your right to eat it. And I think, to me, that speaks a lot about real freedom. Especially, there are some people who diehard anti-pineapple pizza fascists, if I can call them that. But when you have these discussions and you can talk about real philosophy about authoritarianism and statism and who has rights and where do rights come from, it's a lot different conversation when you start talking about this philosophy over a subject that's not necessarily personal to either person. So I'll throw that out there. And anyone watching that wants to check out my campaign and possibly support me, check out Behrman. It's Behrman, Behrman2020.com.
Thanks, Dan. I reached out to John McAfee, who I think, is a guy maybe like yourself who has a pretty good understanding of advanced technology and developing applications. But even he, I don't think, is engaging this conversation in the way that you have. And he also didn't respond to my request for an interview.
He's an interesting character. I don't know how seriously he's taking the run this time. But I actually worked on his campaign in 2016. So he's definitely an awesome guy. He has a lot of great ideas. Yeah, he's McAfee.
Yeah. Well, I just want to reiterate that I think that we can enhance our direct democracy in this 21st century framework, and in doing so, be moving towards a more voluntarist and less abusive nation state framework. And I hope that that your supporters can see the virtue of that, as well as the virtue of these other kinds of reform measures that you discussed. So thank you again for having this conversation. It was very illuminating.
Absolutely. And thank you. I'm always happy to discuss different ideas. I guess that's one other thing I can say. I didn't get here by thinking I was right the whole time. There were plenty of times where I had discussions and learned new things. And I think that's one thing that a lot of the mainstream politicians are missing is the willingness to have a conversation and understand what people actually want and need, and understand what other proposals are and why people are proposing them. To ultimately, we have to figure out a way to make everybody happy, because if it's just the left or just the right, then that's no good for everybody, for anybody.
Yeah, and that's something that's it's not a feature of all of U.S. history. It's something that's very much a feature of this system wherein their main constituents is the lobbyists and not the people that they represent. There's a couple of people who are campaigning for 2020 who, all of their funds and support are coming from people outside of their state. In very specific moneyed special interests, right. And then they have a $20 million war chest to trick the people who don't really like them that much into supporting their campaign. It's a little insane, but it's a system that other countries are doing a little better than we are, and we can be moving towards a more direct democracy in a lot of ways, and a more and a less pernicious form of government in a lot of ways. And I appreciate what you do to advance that discussion.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was good. It was good talking with you. I said this to all of the other candidates that I hope we get a chance to talk. But really, like I'm in Southern Arizona. I would love to do other kinds of events or other kinds of conversations with you. I think that you have a lot to add to a conversation, and I think we could give something back to our respective camps in doing so. So please just keep that in mind.
Absolutely. That sounds great.
All right. Good talking with you, Dan.
All right. You too. I'll see you around.
All right. Bye.